Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to look at the famous science fiction author Philip K. Dick's views on identity. The question of identity, what it really is and entails, was a lifelong obsession for Dick, and it's reflected in many of his works. And he had good reasons for it. Because identity, something that may seem easy to grasp at first glance, immediately becomes elusive and strange as soon as one starts to look more closely at it. To begin, consider that when we ask ourselves, "Who am I?" we often turn to labels: my name, my job, my opinions, my cultural background. Philip K. Dick invites us to interrogate those labels, to ask whether they point to a stable self, or whether they point to a shifting, mutable process. His work repeatedly shows characters whose experience of self breaks, fragments, or recombines, and thus he offers a model of identity less as a fixed thing and more as a dynamic relation. In doing so, he forces us to reconsider what we mean by identity, by self, by human being. Dick's meditations on identity are deeply connected to his concerns about reality. He does not treat identity in isolation. He links it to memory, to perception, to time, to the world around us. In his novels, we see characters who discover that their memories may be false, their perception unreliable, their world constructed. That destabilization of the world tends to undermine the self, because if the world around you can shift, then the self inside you may shift too, or be revealed as less solid than you thought. Dick's main concern, running through almost everything he wrote, is the question of what reality actually is. He wasn't just playing with strange or futuristic ideas for the sake of it. He truly questioned whether the world we experience is real, and whether we can trust what we see and believe. And he didn't do this in a surface-level or playful way. He did it with a seriousness and intensity that set him apart from most writers. He wanted to get under the surface of what we take for granted and show how fragile and uncertain it might actually be. In that way, he forces us to look again at our own lives and ask, what if reality isn't what it seems? What if the things we assume to be solid, like time, memory, and even our sense of self, can't be fully trusted? And when you think about it, there is nothing in and of itself that makes it more plausible that reality is what it appears to be than that it's not. And as we shall see, there are some pretty compelling reasons to suspect that reality is something more, or something else entirely. Let's look at how Dick works with memory and identity. In works like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and its cinematic offspring Blade Runner, the question arises, what happens when the outward form of the self remains, but the inside is altered? If you take away genuine empathy, or if you implant false memories, what remains of the self? In a world where androids may mimic humans, where memories may be manufactured, then identity no longer rests simply on appearance or continuity of biography. What is lost is the implicit assumption that identity is a seamless thread from past to present within one stable consciousness. Dick shows us that the continuity of self can be undone, disrupted, reconstructed. In this sense, our identity becomes less who I was, and more what I believe I am now, and what I remember having been. Then there is the notion of community, culture, and external influence on identity. If one's sense of self arises in part from who one interacts with, what one believes, and the culture one inhabits, then identity cannot be purely internal. Dick implicitly challenges the myth of the self as an island, untouched by social forces or by hidden hands. In his worlds, we see bureaucracies, surveillance, technologies, corporate powers, and even metaphysical entities bending the world, and thus bending the self. Something that may be particularly relevant for the times that we are living in is that identity in Dick's work tends to be thrown into crisis when technology, mind alteration, or conspiracies break the continuity of the self. In other words, identity can both become fragmented and shaped by social forces. Memory, perception, and personal narrative all depend on the world around us. So when the world shifts, the self tends to shift with it. In Ubik, for example, the character's reality starts to erode. What once felt solid no longer holds, and as a result, their sense of identity begins to unravel. The story suggests that the things we take for granted as stable, our surroundings, our memories, even time itself, might not be stable at all. In fact, they might be constantly changing beneath the surface. And when that happens, it makes sense to question who you are. As one commentary notes, Dick's characters often doubt their own identities, and not out of paranoia, but because the evidence around them gives them every reason to. Take a moment to think about this. Not only is the world becoming more and more alien, incomprehensible, elusive, and complex, the very self that we thought we were, that lives in and is shaped by this strange world, might not be as self-evident as it appears to be. We might not even be able to pinpoint what constitutes this self. In his non-fiction and private writings, Dick also addresses identity explicitly. His journals, often grouped under the title The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick, explore his mystical experiences, his sense that the self was penetrated by something beyond ordinary consciousness, and his belief that reality had been manipulated. These experiences force him to ask, who am I as the subject of this? What is observing and remembering? What is the relation of the self to a greater intelligence? In this way, his metaphysical investigations and his fiction feed one another. His sense that there is an active intelligence, sometimes called VALIS in his work, that intervenes in consciousness means the self is not simply the independent locus of control, but a point of interaction. That shifts the identity question again. We are not just defined by our choices, but by what we receive, what we are influenced by, what we let in. What comes out of all this is a way of seeing identity as something that can shift and change. It isn't fixed. Who you experience yourself as can change when your memories change, or when the way you see the world changes. Your sense of self also depends on what's around you. Other people, technology, society, and maybe even something beyond this world. And it's not something you fully control. Sometimes you're shaped by things you didn't choose, or by things that happen to you. So identity isn't just something you decide for yourself. It's something that's built through your connection to everything you're part of. This also highlights something significant, namely that, seen from this perspective, identity is not who we are, but who we experience ourselves as. And how well defined this experience is varies greatly from person to person. Now, why is that important for us today? Because in our times, we are presented with more and stranger phenomena that disrupt our sense of self than ever. Digital selves, media manipulation, information overload, globalization, algorithms shaping our worldviews, groups that push us to choose sides, artificial intelligence, and archaic brains and bodies meeting a rapidly evolving high-tech society, just to name a few things. Seen in this light, Dick's questions have become more urgent. When you live in an era where your social media self may differ significantly from your lived self, where your memories may be selective or edited, where your sense of what is real may be mediated by screens and corporations, then the stability of identity is more fragile. Dick's fiction offers a warning as well as a tool. To pay attention to the formation of self. To understand that yourself is more than what you narrate about yourself, more than what you imagine about what you were, and more than what the world says you are. Let's now draw the threads together by walking through three interconnected aspects in the Dick schema of identity: memory and falseness, reality and perception, and transcendence and authenticity. Let's look at the first aspect: memory and falseness. As touched upon earlier, Dick often shows memory as unreliable, even manufactured. Characters may believe they have lived one thing only to discover that memory is false or manipulated. If the memory that frames your narrative of self is false, then your identity is built on sand. This forces you to ask, how much of what I believe about myself is memory? How much of that memory is mine? How much of it is given to me, imposed on me, or borrowed? In his essays, Dick points to the notion that there could be fake humans, or humans who think they are human, but are missing what makes them human. The critique of what it means to be human is, in fact, a critique of what it means to have an identity. On to the second aspect, reality and perception. If your world is shifting, if your basic assumption of what is outside you fails, then your sense of self will follow. Dick's many alternate world, simulation, layered reality scenarios show that identity depends on the stability of the world. If you are no longer sure where the boundary lies between you and the world, between memory and present, between illusion and fact, then the self becomes tentative. Here you can also see another theme emerge: identity as story. A story anchored in memory, perception, and world. If any of those shift, the story changes. Thus, identity becomes a process of ongoing interpretation. You are constantly editing your story of who you are in light of what you perceive, what you remember, and what you believe. The third aspect is transcendence and authenticity. At one level, Dick asks, what is the authentic self in a world of deception, simulation, and compulsion? If many of our identities are shaped by external forces, then authenticity emerges as the capacity to recognize those forces, to respond rather than reflexively accept, to discover a self that holds even when the facade falls away. His mystical experiences suggest there is a self beyond the constructed persona, the true self that transcends memory, perception, and even personal narrative. In his fiction, the demarcation between human and android, human and machine, human and simulation becomes a way to ask, what does it mean to be truly human? Not in appearance, but in being. To be human is to be more than what is recorded on a database of identity, more than what is projected outward. Dick says the question is, what constitutes the authentic human being? The implication is that the self you identify with now may not be the self that is authentic. That recognition invites you into self-inquiry. In nonfiction, Dick registers his own crisis of identity over time. He experimented with substances, had mystical episodes, and questioned the boundary between self and other, human and divine, reality and illusion. He writes in his journals about the possibility that the self is penetrated by an outside intelligence, that the self is a node in a larger network of mind and meaning. This transforms the question of identity from "who am I?" into "who is allowing this to be me? Who is being me now? What am I a part of?" It places identity into a larger field of relational being rather than isolated individuality. In short, when you view identity through the lens of Philip K. Dick, you see that identity is not simply a statement of who you are, but a question of who you are becoming, how you are shifting, what forces shape you, your level of consciousness and intentionality in relation to your identity, what you take on, what you reject, and what you respond to. You see that identity is entwined with reality, memory, perception, and relationship. And you see that identity has both an everyday dimension, your roles, histories, and labels, and an extraordinary dimension, your presence, your capacity for awareness, your participation in being rather than just doing. That double dimension places the self in movement, not fixed, not finished, but alive. In summary, Philip K. Dick's work shows us that identity isn't something fixed or easily defined. Instead, it's something that shifts depending on our memories, our perceptions, our surroundings, and even forces we don't fully understand. What we think of as me can be shaped by false memories, outside influences, and the stories we tell ourselves. His characters often discover that what they believe to be real isn't real at all, and that includes their sense of self. Through his fiction and personal experiences, Dick suggests that identity is more like an ongoing process than a solid thing. It's shaped by the world, but also by how we relate to that world. In today's fast-moving, technology-driven reality, this message feels more relevant than ever. We are invited not just to question who we are, but to stay open to who we might become. Finally, Philip K. Dick doesn't offer a final definition of identity. What he does offer is a lens, a way to see that the self is not a finished product, but something always in motion. In his stories and in his own life, identity is not simply what you believe about yourself or what society labels you as. It's shaped by what you remember, by what you forget, by what you believe is real, and by the things that quietly shape you without your noticing. His work invites us to slow down and ask, how much of who I think I am comes from the world around me? My culture, the media I consume, the technology I use every day. How much of it is habit? How much is fear? How much is still being written? These are not abstract questions. They're practical ones that you need to ask yourself seriously if you truly want to understand their implications. Because the version of yourself that you act and speak from, make decisions from, protect, defend, or promote, shapes not just your experience of the world, but your place in it. Dick's characters often find themselves pulled between different versions of reality, forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that what they believed about the world and about themselves might not hold up. And as strange or destabilizing as that may sound, there's also a freedom in it. If identity isn't fixed, it means we're not trapped in the roles or stories we've been handed. If memory isn't always reliable, we can learn to look at it with more curiosity and less certainty. If reality itself can shift, we can become more conscious of the ways we respond to those shifts. This doesn't mean you have to let go of everything you thought you were. It just means that you recognize it as impermanent and that you're allowed to question it. You're allowed to explore the deeper layers underneath the surface. What remains when labels fall away, when expectations loosen, and when the noise of the world quiets for a moment. We live in a time where identities are more public, more performative, and more easily distorted than ever. We've already mentioned social media, digital footprints, targeted content, algorithms, and AI, and how they all contribute to a sense of self that may feel splintered or unstable. And when you add to that the speed at which the world changes, it's no wonder that many feel disoriented. But disorientation doesn't have to be a problem. It can also be an opening, an opportunity to reflect, to adjust, to become more intentional about which parts of your identity you carry forward and which parts you're ready to leave behind. For many, it may even be an invitation to step into something completely new and fluid, something that is no longer defined by any of the structures that used to define them, or by the need for the human experience to be stable or make sense. And maybe this is the most important thing Dick shows us, that you don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to know once and for all who you are. But you do need to stay awake to the process. Stay aware of what shapes you. Stay honest about what no longer fits. And stay open to the possibility that your identity is not a single answer, but an ongoing relationship with reality, experience, and choice. In the end, the self you assume today might not be the self you'll feel aligned with tomorrow. That doesn't mean something's gone wrong. It just means you're still alive, still changing, still capable of growing into a version of yourself that feels more real, more grounded, and more free. And maybe we shouldn't be afraid of losing who we are at all, but instead be curious about who we might become if we stop pretending that anything in our sense of self remains forever, or that who we are is already decided. Now, before you go, we just want to mention that If you wish to delve deeper into this topic, we have several other videos on identity based on different authors available on the end screen right now. You've now reached the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for your time.